Welcome back, everybody. We're going to take a look at another Sabaton history video today, and I'm intentionally watching the Sabaton history videos that go along with the Sabaton music videos I've already watched. After this one, the next Sabaton video, I'll go back and watch another new music video. So if you're wondering kind of where I'm going with all of this, and I will be doing some other things as well in addition to the Sabaton stuff, but this seems to get by far the most views. So we'll watch Bismarck today, and then we're going to go watch another music video, and then we'll come back to the history again and kind of catch up on some of the other ones I've already done. One thing I want to say up front, because this has definitely been an ongoing conversation, so much so that I've pinned a comment on my original video watching the song Bismarck. That was my very first introduction to Sabaton, by the way. And we'll probably get into this conversation during this video, I'm sure. But there's a lot of debate going on, a lot of people attempting to correct me because I referred to Bismarck as she during the video. And I want to say historically that is totally fine. In fact, either would be appropriate in the case of the Bismarck. The only reference we have to Bismarck being referred to he, contemporary reference during the war, comes from the highest ranking surviving officer from the Bismarck, who after the sinking reported that Captain Lindemann, who was the commanding officer of the Bismarck, had told the crew that a ship like the Bismarck should be a he because of how powerful it was. And it sounds, at least according to that officer, as though the officers around Captain Lindemann were asked to refer to the ship as he. Now, no other contemporary source that I've been able to find, I've looked on message boards, I've looked through the history, referred to Bismarck as he. That came after Bismarck had already been sunk. There's no record of anybody else in the Kriegsmarine calling it he. There's no record of any other Navy, any other person calling it he. But that has kind of come down in history as Bismarck should be referred to as he. My view on this historically is that either would be appropriate. So if I find myself referring to Bismarck as she, that's totally fine because that's historically how ships were referred to in every Navy. But he is also appropriate because that's what the captain used. That's what it sounds like the crew must have used, at least according to that one source. So that is that. But I don't want to debate that. I want to talk about Bismarck, and I'm just going to dive into the history, and I'll kind of pause here and there to react to some things, but let's see what they have to say.
Germany's Bismarck was the largest battleship ever built. But of course,
all right, we got to stop right there because that's not true. I guess it depends on how you refer to largest battleship ever built, because if we're talking in history, obviously that's not true. There were other World War II battleships that were larger, much larger. Yamato, Japanese battleship, which had already been laid down and was launched later in 1940, I think, was significantly larger than Bismarck by several, by tens of thousands of tons. I think Yamato was like 70,000 tons. Bismarck wasn't even, in terms of tonnage, the largest battleship involved in the battles the Bismarck was in. King George V was slightly larger in terms of tonnage. So I don't know if they mean guns, if they mean armor, if they mean length, but in terms of tonnage, absolutely not the case.
Being the biggest means you're also the biggest target.
And it was also one of the most requested songs that you guys wanted us to sing about.
Makes sense.
So we did.
It's a great song.
We'll get to the song in just a minute, but first, here's the story of the Bismarck. As the construction of the two Bismarck-class battleships began in 1936 in Germany, Britain was anything but worried. By treaty since World War I, Germany could not have any battleships that could challenge France and Great Britain.
So that's just one more way that Germany was just completely screwed by the Treaty of Versailles. They were limited in terms of their military. They were certainly limited in terms of navy. Of course, most navies were limited because of the Washington Naval Treaty, but Germany just was hit in every single way you can imagine, militarily, economically. But of course, when Hitler came to power, that changed.
In 1935, Hitler had even voluntarily agreed to limit the total tonnage of his navy, the Kriegsmarine, to 35% of the British fleet. However, the launch of the first new battleship in February 1939 showed that not only had Hitler disregarded the treaty, the Bismarck class was something the world had never seen. Christened Bismarck by the granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck, Germany's first chancellor, the ship was, like its twin, the Tirpitz, 251 meters long and 36 meters wide, larger than anything the British or French had. Its 8 38-centimeter guns placed in 4 twin turrets were the biggest guns ever placed on a German warship. Additional medium artillery and anti-aircraft guns completed the armaments, while its range-finding center was top of the line. But it was not just strong offensively. If it was to go toe-to-toe with French battleships, as had seemed the most logical enemy in 1936, it had to be able to withstand some hits without going down. The main armor belt was up to 32 centimeters of super-strong Wotan steel. Its double-walled hull could absorb the shock from a torpedo and disperse it around the hull.
And this was brilliant construction, and you see that played out because Bismarck took an absolute shellacking in the final battle and still would not go down, and eventually was probably scuttled by her own crew, or his own crew. Yeah, Bismarck was definitely built to withstand, but the problem ended up being that as strong as Bismarck was, if Bismarck got hit in just the right place, it didn't matter how powerful the armor was. It didn't matter how great the technology was, and that is what ends up taking Bismarck down.
The transverse bulkhead was between 11 and 22 centimeters thick and was segmented into 22 compartments that could be individually sealed in case of flooding. Its 12 high-pressure boilers and its munition chambers had an additional armor strength of 8 to 12 centimeters. All in all, with 44% of its weight dedicated to defense, it seemed impossible that this ship could be sunk.
And that's actually really a fantastic point. 44% of the weight dedicated toward defense. This thing was built to be able to take on multiple British or French ships at one time and survive. And again, like I said, I mean, this is kind of like the Death Star. The Death Star is this incredibly powerful weapon in Star Wars, but there are weaknesses. And in Bismarck's case, an oil leak and a rudder damage from a torpedo end up being the problem.
By the time the ship was officially commissioned on August 24, 1940, the war had turned Europe upside down, and it was British shipping, not French, that was the main enemy at sea. The German invasion of Norway had deprived the British of strategic positions in the North Sea. And if the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau could combine their strength with both the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, it would mean a daunting German battle group for the British to tackle.
I don't think that ever happened, but could you imagine Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, Tirpitz, and Bismarck together? I mean, I don't know what the British or French could have put together that could have taken that on.
And as the battle for Britain raged in the air, German submarines targeted shipping in the Atlantic, Britain's lifeline. If such a battle group joined the hunt for freighters bound for Britain, Britain could be starved into submission. Food rationing had already been imposed on the British public, and the German subs operating from French ports sank over 260,000 tons of shipping in August alone. This was exactly what Admiral Erich Raeder of the Kriegsmarine had in mind when he gave command of the Bismarck to Admiral Gunther Lutyens. Second in command was Ernst Lindemann. The crew, over 2,000 strong, was not conscripts, but volunteers from all over Germany. They were top-notch men. In the Baltic Sea, the Bismarck had its first training exercise against a mock battle cruiser, Hood. HMS Hood, built at the end of the First World War, was for a long time the British flagship and symbolized the might of the Royal Navy. The first tests were favorable. The Bismarck could reach a top speed of 30.8 knots and outrun any potential threat, but there were two weaknesses. First, the recoil of the heavy guns was extreme, and it was uncertain if, under combat conditions, the force of the naval guns firing would harm the ship's equipment. The second weakness showed during a simulated rudder failure. Without rudders, it was very hard to maneuver the ship. Well, rudders and propellers were always a weakness on any ship, though, and the German Admiralty dismissed the problem, since hitting the rudder during combat was extremely unlikely. By April 1941, the Bismarck was ready for combat. It was to head back to the North Sea, catch up with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and meet Gneisenau in the Atlantic. Raeder gave the order that over 3 months, it was to sink as many freighters as possible.
I actually didn't know that. I didn't know that it was supposed to meet up with the Gneisenau out in the Atlantic to go. I knew that it was supposed to go convoy hunting, and it went with the Prinz Eugen. But that's something I definitely did not know before, and boy, that would have probably made a real difference.
The might of the Bismarck would allow the battle group to even attack guarded convoys. However, at the time, both the Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen were damaged awaiting repairs. The Bismarck waited. On May the 5th, Adolf Hitler visited the ship. Now, Hitler was a fan of battleships. He loved the design, but he had no knowledge of tactical or strategic naval warfare. He was, however, fearful when it came to naval operations. On the one hand, he wanted to protect and enhance the propaganda image of the mighty German forces. On the other, he wanted to avoid agitating the neutral Americans and their freight shipping. So the Kriegsmarine kept Hitler in the dark about his plans. On August 18th, the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen were to secretly head into the Atlantic. Those two ships were strong enough to do some serious damage to British trade.
Yep.
It was likely that the British knew that the Bismarck was battle-ready, but still, secrecy was the key to success. Until they reached the Atlantic, the Bismarck could run into a British trap and be overwhelmed by numerically superior forces. But you know, how they hoped to keep the largest battleship in the world floating around out there a secret is beyond me. Anyhow, the 20th, the Bismarck was spotted, and a day later, members of the Norwegian resistance observed the German ship hiding in the fjords. They informed the British. Now, Admiral Sir John Tovey, aboard the new flagship King George V, was chief of the British Home Fleet. He was ordered by the British Admiralty to locate and
It's a great
engage the
picture,
Bismarck.
by the way.
That ship was not to reach the Atlantic, period. Tovey could not, though, know the exact route the Bismarck would take. So he ordered Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland to take the Hood and make for Iceland with HMS Prince of Wales to cut off the most likely path. Back home, the Kriegsmarine informed Hitler about Bismarck's departure on the 23rd. Hitler was furious and wanted to recall the ship, fearing that the pride of Germany might be destroyed, but rather assured him that everything was fine, especially now that the German invasion plans for Crete were finalizing.
So, interesting mindset there by Hitler. Is much more like the World War I mindset, which was, we've got all this invested into this great battleship. Let's not risk it being destroyed. That's kind of what happened after Jutland in World War I, is that these navies, they clash, and then they're so afraid of losing all their ships that the Germans just kind of keep theirs back the rest of the time and never really provoke another big fight. And it sounds like that's kind of what Hitler wanted to do here.
Bismarck would keep the British from sending additional ships into the Mediterranean. Spotted again by the evening, two British heavy cruisers, the Suffolk and the Norfolk, had taken its scent. And I mean that quite literally. The Suffolk was equipped with a superior new radar system, and the heavy cruiser shadowed the Bismarck and gave its whereabouts to the rest of the British fleet. Bismarck also seemed to be pursued by bad luck. Not only could they not evade the new radar system, the first time they fired on the pursuing heavy cruisers, the recoil of the guns damaged their own radar system.
Yep.
So they had no idea what was heading their way. It was the Hood and the Prince of Wales. The Hood had more guns than the Bismarck, but way less armor. The crew was also inexperienced because since the end of the First World War, it had not fired a shot in combat. The battleships closed in on each other. The first to draw blood was the Prinz Eugen, hitting one of the Hood's munition chambers. And then, just as the Hood was turning
yep.
to bring its aft guns to bear, the fourth salvo from the Bismarck smashed into it, punching through its armor and detonating inside the ship's main munition chamber. A moment of shock paused the battle as HMS Hood was engulfed by a giant fireball and split in half. The Prince of Wales returned fire on the Bismarck, damaging it, but was in turn itself hit, which destroyed the bridge and killed the officers. The Prince of Wales turned and fled.
So you can imagine just how devastating that hit on the Hood must have been. I think there were only, 3 survivors on the Hood? If there's only 3 survivors, that shows you how complete and how quick the destruction was on that ship, that it just took out everybody at once, that people didn't even have time to escape into the water.
Admiral Lutyens decided not to pursue, but to check the damage on Bismarck. It had only received 1 hit, but was taking on water. One of the boiler rooms had to be abandoned, but more importantly,
Oil
the
leak.
foremost fuel depots were leaking. Lutyens evaluated his options. He had damaged the Prince of Wales and destroyed the Hood, a major victory. Indeed, it had been a lucky shot, and the battle had not lasted 10 minutes, but only 3 of the 1,419 men aboard the Hood had survived. But the Bismarck could not now reach top speed, and his fuel was lower than planned. Yep, Bismarck was always referred to as a he. Lutyens could return the way he came to Norway or try to break through to Saint-Nazaire, France for repairs. He chose France. The death of the Hood was indeed a shock to the British public. Admiral Tovey was ordered to destroy the Bismarck with all ships available.
Yeah, they're mad
Norfolk
now.
and Suffolk were still shadowing the Bismarck, but neither could slow it down. The only ships close enough to do that were Force H, HMS Sheffield, HMS Renown, and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, with 18 Swordfish torpedo bombers aboard. Those biplanes looked like World War I, but could reach 100 knots, enough to catch the Bismarck. Lutyens was pessimistic about his chances, since basically the whole British home fleet was on his heels.
Yep.
Force H made contact with the Bismarck May 25th, but the Renown and the Sheffield were too weak to engage. 15 torpedo bombers did instead that night. Such small planes are hard to hit with AA guns, especially at night.
Now, if I remember right, and I don't know if they'll refer to this, I think the initial torpedo attack, they attacked one of their own ships. They mistook, I don't remember which one it was, but they mistook one of their own ships for the Bismarck. Thankfully, the torpedo, I don't know if it was a dud or what happened, but it didn't do any damage to the ship, and they were able to attack Bismarck successfully.
And with suicidal bravery, they closed in and released torpedoes at 300 meters. The first torpedoes did minimal damage, but Bismarck was hit in the stern while making evasive maneuvers, and inrushing water blocked the rudder. Bismarck's Achilles heel had been hit. Engineers tried desperately to find a solution, but the water pressure was too high to send in mechanics. The situation seemed hopeless as the British ships closed in. Admiral Lutyens radioed Berlin, "Ship disabled. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Fuhrer." Tovey planned to engage the Bismarck from all sides, with the battleships King George V and Rodney attacking from the west, while the Norfolk would come in from the north and the heavy cruiser Dorsetshire would attack from the east. In the early morning of the 27th, they sighted the slowly swaying Bismarck. Rodney and George V opened fire. Bismarck returned fire, but soon 2 of his turrets were knocked out of action. A shell hit the artillery command center, killing the officers. Lucky hits, but decisive ones. Bismarck was blinded. The shelling continued, and by 9:15, Bismarck was a burning wreck. He fired his final shots just after 9:30 as his last turrets were destroyed.
See, that's the thing, man. Bismarck was designed to take a beating, but there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can plan for lucky shots. The shot that caused the fuel leak was a lucky shot in a less than 10-minute engagement at the Battle of the Denmark Strait. The shot from the torpedo from the Swordfish that took out the rudder was a lucky shot from that torpedo, but it was perfect. And then taking out the ability to target and then taking out the turrets, that's not stuff you can protect against if people get those lucky shots. And at that point, Bismarck was still powerful and still really hard to sink, but completely worthless as a battleship.
The Bismarck was done. Of the 2,876 shells fired on it, 400 hit the ship in a little over half an hour. Now it was the execution of a helpless enemy. Within the ship, it was pure hell, from poisonous gases, fire, heat, cold water, oil, and blood from the dead and dying. At 10:15, Lindemann, since Lutyens was probably dead at that point, gave the order to abandon ship. This the men who could did, as shells rained down, killing hundreds of sailors. The Dorsetshire fired 3 torpedoes as the final blow, and Bismarck disappeared beneath the waves at 10:40. Just 115 of his crewmen would survive. Hitler learned about the disaster not from Admiral Raeder, but from the British press. The Kriegsmarine had refrained from telling him the truth, fearing his anger. And so ends the brief adventures of the Bismarck, the mightiest battleship of all. Again, the biggest ship makes the biggest target.
So the rest of the video, they just kind of talk about how they came about writing the song and talking about that. But since I want to focus mainly on the history, I think I'll go ahead and wrap it up right there. I remember as a kid watching the movie Sink the Bismarck, and it was always one of my favorites. And so Bismarck was right up there with Titanic as kind of having that lore for me, that kind of mythical quality to it that I always thought was really interesting, the what if, because Bismarck, like the Titanic, sank on what was basically the maiden voyage, the first time out. And it's interesting that the same man, Robert Ballard, who found Titanic in 1985, later found Bismarck as well. So I thought that was pretty cool. But let me know your thoughts about Bismarck, about the Battle of the Atlantic, about the Battle of the Denmark Strait, about this video, about the song, any and all of the above. Use the comment section below. Hit that like button if you would. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And continue the conversation as well over on Discord. You can find the links in the description below for that and for Patreon. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.